I'll begin by introducing myself. I'm Jeff Boughton here with Kowa Sporting. Saturday webinars, have them weekends at least. Once in a while, we just can't pull it off. But generally speaking, throughout the lockdown, we've been able to do this, and it's been a lot of fun. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending weekly meeting. We got a real special treat for you today. Jared Clarke, our friend from the Great White North, with BirdTheRock Nature Tours, is going to take us on a virtual birding tour of his regular stomping grounds of Newfoundland and Labrador, and it's going to be a really great talk. So again, welcome. As always, we're going to try and hold the questions you may have to the end, but for those that don't already know, if you aren't already an expert by now on Zoom, we have both a chat bar below, and specifically probably for questions, it's better if you can drop it into the Q&A tab below. If you hover over the over that bottom portion of your screen, you'll see that the Q&A will show up. So if you just type in any questions you may have on the Q&A tab, we will I'll be looking at those, and on Facebook Live, where we're streaming on the Kowa Sporting Optics page, and I'll be looking for comments and questions there throughout. But with no further ado, with no further ado, I would like to turn this over to Jared Clarke, because I'm looking as forward to learning more about this part of the world, I've often wanted to bird in and haven't. So looking forward to hearing about it as well, Jared. Thanks for joining us and taking the time. We appreciate you.
All right, great, thanks. Can people see me now? All right, well, thanks everyone for joining today. I was gonna say you're a really great looking audience, but all I can see is Jeff, so.
Oh, sorry.
Still a great looking audience. Yeah, I have so much to show and tell you guys today. I really wanted to give you guys an impression of what it is to come and spend a week or so birding in Newfoundland and Labrador, which is where I'm lucky enough to live. And if you learn anything out of this webinar today, I think it's going to be that we love where I live, and I can talk about it all day. I'll just try not to. So before we move on, maybe I should tell you a little bit about who I am. I am a native Newfoundlander. I grew up in central Newfoundland, about 4 hours away from where I live now in St. John's. Growing up, I was always an outdoors person, always interested in nature. But it wasn't until I got into university that I really got hooked on birds and became a very avid birder. And a few years later, actually, while I was in grad school, I started leading a few nature tours, bird-related tours, sort of just in my spare time. Some charter tours for Maine Audubon and Massachusetts Audubon, and I realized I absolutely loved it. I loved sharing my passion of not only the birds, but of where I live with other people and who shared similar interests. So I continued in grad school, and I actually have a training as a medical researcher. But the birding and the bird tours just started taking more and more of my time and my interest. And nowadays, I am full-time into birding tourism. I run a small business called BirdTheRock. You can see the logo and the website here on your right. And yeah, so I spend much of my year leading small group and private birding tours here in Newfoundland and Labrador year-round. So, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that, about especially summer, but also how winter is such a great time to come birding here. So I operate tours year-round, and to fill in the extra time, I'm actually really fortunate in that I also get to do in this job some traveling, and I lead tours in other places around Canada and around the world for some really great ecotourism companies, especially Eagle Eye Tours. So for those of you who don't know, that's another Canadian birding tour company who offers tours worldwide. Really great to travel with, really great to work with. So I invite you, besides my own things, I invite you to check out Eagle Eye Tours and some of their great offerings if you're interested in birding in other places around the world. So Newfoundland and Labrador. So for those of you who aren't too familiar with Newfoundland and Labrador, we're the easternmost province in Canada. You can see on the map here. So we're actually at the very eastern edge of both Canada and North America. And it puts us in a really neat place geographically for a whole lot of reasons. The province is made up of an island portion, which is Newfoundland, and a mainland portion, which is Labrador, as you can see here on the map. Newfoundland itself is the 16th largest island in the world. A lot of people sort of underestimate, if they've never been here, just how big an island it is. At about 109,000 square kilometers, it's quite a large island. And just to give you an idea, if you look on the map of the island here, to leave from the capital, St. John's, here in the very east southeastern edge, and drive all the way to the northern tip at Lonesome Meadows, is about 1,100 kilometers or 700 miles. So it's 12 hours of straight driving. So it really is quite a large island. And of course, Labrador, the mainland part of the province, is even larger. The whole population of the province is about 560,000 people. So not a lot of people for such a large area. The vast majority are here on the island. Labrador is not nearly as settled, and in lots of ways, much of Labrador is less accessible. A lot of it is, it's interior. There's not roads going to it, fly-in only kinds of places. So for the most part, for this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the island of Newfoundland. But I'm always happy to chat about Labrador. There are some amazing places that I would love to visit that I haven't visited there yet, including the Torngat Mountains National Park. I was supposed to be getting there, unfortunately, this October, but that trip has been canceled due to all this COVID situation. So quite a large province, and actually Newfoundland and Labrador is 3 times larger than the rest of the maritime provinces in Canada put together. So a very large area, but very manageable to do in a short sort of 2-week vacation if you're thinking about coming to see much of the island. Before we even get into the birds, I just want to tell you a little bit more about the island and why it's so interesting. It's very interesting in lots of ways from a natural history point of view. One of the things that I find most interesting goes back to the very origins of the island, so the geological origins. And if you look at this map here on the right, you can see that the eastern zone, which is where I'm located right now in St. John's here on the Avalon Peninsula, originates from Gondwana, so it's now Africa. So this little bit of the island was once attached to what is probably modern-day Morocco. And if you look at the western zone on the other side, it originated from Laurentia, which is the North American supercontinent way back. And at that time, there was an ancient ocean called the Iapetus Ocean in between. So much of what is central Newfoundland now is actually parts of that ancient seabed that were sort of smushed up between the 2 pieces of western and eastern Newfoundland when they came together hundreds of millions of years ago, and then the rest of the Atlantic Ocean opened up. So some really interesting, very different geological origins for different parts of the island, and that really impacts a lot of things that we still see today. So for example, if you were to go to the very southern end of the eastern zone, you can go to Mistaken Point UNESCO World Heritage Site and see some of the oldest fossils of multicellular organisms in the world, 565 million years old. And you can actually walk on an ancient seabed that's just covered in these fossils. Absolutely incredible. If you go to the very western side of the island, to Grossmore National Park, you can walk on the tablelands, which is one of the few places in the world where part of the Earth's mantle actually pushes up through the crust. So just some really neat geological things. It also impacts life on the island today. So for example, the plant life can be very different between the western and eastern parts of the island because of for example, the abundance of limestone on the western part of the island and the more sedimentary type stone here on the eastern end. And of course, we're in Iceberg Alley. So we get lots of reminders that the Ice Age was not actually that long ago that float by our coast every year. It's a pretty amazing place to live. Also has a really interesting human history. I like to think of Newfoundland as the place where humanity came full circle. So if you think back to the very origins of humanity, when people left Africa and some people sort of headed east through Asia and eventually migrated across the Siberian land bridge into what's now North America and across North America, Newfoundland would have been one of the last places that those people would have reached, having crossed all across North America and eventually arriving into the eastern edges of North America. The earliest people arrived in Labrador just after the last ice age, about 7,500 years ago. And the first evidence of humans inhabiting the island of Newfoundland was about 5,000 years ago. So quite a long time ago in the way that we think about North American settlement. There are currently 4 groups of Aboriginal people that still abide in the province. But then if you think of those other people who came out of Africa and headed west and, you know, into Europe and settled Europe, the Norse were actually probably the first Europeans to arrive anywhere in North America. They arrived in Newfoundland at about 1000 AD, so just over 1,000 years ago, where we know that they met up through their writings with some of the natives people living here. So in lots of ways, you can think of Newfoundland and Labrador as being where humanity came full circle, and those people who went west out of Africa and those who went east out of Africa finally met up again, you know, hundreds of thousands of years later. So a pretty interesting thing. Modern Europeans began arriving here quite early in North America's history, starting in at least 1497. And there have been people fishing and living here ever since, mostly English, French, and Irish, but even the Basque have lived here at some point. So what you have now when you come to Newfoundland is just a really rich and colorful human history, and lots of really great culture that you can take in and enjoy. So if you do come here, I know that most of you would be coming here to visit the birds, but I can promise you that it's the people and the scenery, the culture, the history. Those are the things that will probably stick with you when you do come. But as I said, I can talk about Newfoundland and Labrador all day long. You didn't come here to hear about that. You came here to hear about the birds. And on top of all of those amazing things, Newfoundland and Labrador is a fantastic birding destination. Our location here in Canada's Northeast makes us a really interesting place with a great mix of birds and a never-ending variety, because it can be very different in each month as the seasons change. So it's a very diverse and very fluid place when it comes to bird life. So I think the most important thing, and a lot of things that people think about when they think about birds and Newfoundland together, are the seabirds. And no doubt our seabirds are the icons of Newfoundland when it comes to birds. Our province, fortunately, is home to some of the world's most spectacular seabird colonies, large, very diverse seabird colonies. And just as important as the fact that they're absolutely spectacular, and they are, is that several of them are actually quite accessible. So we have several large seabird colonies that are very easy to visit compared to lots of other large seabird colonies across the world. Some of them are even accessible by land. So it's easy enough here in Newfoundland in midsummer on a fairly leisurely day of birding to see more than a dozen of some of the most sought after seabirds in the North Atlantic. So you can see here just in this collage, we have everything from black-legged kittiwake to Atlantic puffin, razorbill, murres, gannets, fulmars. So an absolutely wonderful array of seabirds that you can see birding here in Newfoundland. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the Atlantic puffin first. Probably our most bird. It is our provincial bird as well. And a lot of people who come here, whether they're birders or not, they want to see an Atlantic puffin. It's one of the things they want to see on any vacation to Newfoundland. And fortunately for us, it's our provincial bird for a reason. We have lots of them. And if you go to the right places, they're not that hard to see. In fact, North America's largest colony of Atlantic puffins is located just 30 minutes drive and a very short boat ride from the capital here in St. John's, which is quite great for a lot of tourists. It's called the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve, and you can see here from this map, the reserve itself is a series of 4 small islands that are located only about a mile off the mainland of Newfoundland. So you can actually take boat tours out there, and there are a number of commercial boat tours that leave from the communities of Babels, Witless Bay, and Mobile. And very short boat tours, sometimes an hour and a half or 2 hours, and you're back on shore again after having had an amazing seabird experience. So again, here are just some more images of Atlantic puffins that were taken in the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve on some of the islands where they breed there, as well as from some of the boat tours. The boat tours, as I said, there are several commercial operators. Some of them there's something for everybody. Some of them are large boats, like you see here in the photo, that are very stable on the water and great for families and great for leisurely, nice boat tours. Right down to Zodiac tours, which are a little bit more adventurous, a little bit faster. And they all have their pros and cons, but they're all amazing ways to see some of our seabirds up close and personal. And I'm happy to, afterwards in the question and answer, if someone wants to contact me later, if you need some help choosing what kind of boat tour fits best for your situation, I'm always happy to give advice as to the different kinds of boat tours and what works best for who. But it is it's one of the delights of living here is that I get to go out on these boat tours weekly during the summer and enjoy the incredible spectacle that is the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve. But don't be worried if you're somebody who's very prone to seasickness, absolutely does not like to get on a boat, or in some cases are somebody who's more focused on the photography, which I know can be kind of difficult from a moving boat. We do have a few places for you as well. There are a few places on the island where you can see Atlantic puffin colonies from the comfort of shore. One of the most well-known ones is Elliston. You can see here on the map. It's up on the tip of the Bonavista Peninsula. It's a smaller puffin colony that you can sort of walk right up to. It is a little bit, the colony itself is separated from the mainland by just but you can sit on the shoreline and watch the puffins coming and going, and sometimes they'll honor you by flying across to your side, and you can be sometimes within feet of some of these puffins. So it's great for the photographers. It's a wonderful place as well to go and see the puffins. You just won't see them in such large numbers as you will if you take a boat tour to the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve. But getting back to the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve, I can give you 4 million other reasons why you should make sure you are able to squeeze in a visit there if ever you come to Newfoundland and Labrador. Because even though there are 500,000 puffins in that reserve, like I said, it's North America's largest colony and the second largest in the world. They're actually outnumbered by the 4 million other seabirds that breed there during the summer. So that's right, there's 4.5 million breeding seabirds in this one colony from May to August. It is an incredible spectacle to go out there, and sometimes the sky is just black with birds, and the cliffs and the grassy hills on the islands are just covered in seabirds. It's like something out of a nature documentary, and you really feel like you're seeing and experiencing one of the great spectacles of nature when you go out there. I know people who've birded all over the world at some really amazing and legendary places, and after they've been out on this boat tour, they'll all, it's one of the highlights of their birding career is to have been there. So it absolutely is something that you should see. So in addition to the puffins, you can see from some of the photos here, we have most of the other alcids that breed in the North Atlantic. Common murre, both forms there, the bridled and the non-bridled. Thick-billed murre in smaller numbers breed throughout the colony. So they're a more northerly breeding seabird, and these are some of the most southerly breeding locations for them in the world. Razorbills as well, black guillemots, not pictured here. All those other alcids, which are close cousins of the puffins, are all breeding in larger numbers even than the puffins in some cases in the reserve. So there's lots of other reasons to go to the reserve. You'll also find tens of thousands of black-legged kittiwakes breeding there. Much scarcer is the northern fulmar that you see there at the bottom. They do breed within the colony, and they're pretty reliable if you know where to look. So if you're with a guide who knows where to look for the northern fulmars, it's another species you can find breeding on the islands there. Other gulls, such as great black-backed and herring gulls breeding on the island. And this little guy that you can actually see me holding here is a Leach's storm petrel, a much smaller tube nose than the fulmar. It's just a little robin-sized seabird. And they actually far outnumber the puffin. So they breed on the islands, about 1 million of them breeding there in little burrows. But because they have very nocturnal habits, they only come and go to their burrows under the cover of darkness because they're so prone to being predated. It's actually quite rare to see them on the boat tours. And I would say that in the dozens of times that I've been out on these boat tours to see these islands, I've only seen Leach's storm petrel out there maybe 3 times on foggy days. And I know guys who have worked on the boat tours for years and have never seen one on one of the tours. So they're a little harder to see, despite the fact that there's a million of them on the islands. It's quite amazing. So this is just shows you some of the diversity of birds that you can see on a 2-hour boat tour, that you don't have to go way offshore like you do in pelagic tours. It's quite an amazing thing, and it definitely is a highlight of any birder's visit to Newfoundland and Labrador. And I can think of maybe a few other reasons why you might want to take one of these boat tours. The Witless Bay Ecological Reserve is also one of the best places during the summer to see whales in Newfoundland and Labrador. We get a good congregation of humpbacks and fin whales and minke whales there throughout the summer. And in fact, most of these boat tours cater more to whale watchers than bird watchers in some ways. So it's absolutely, it can be a real fun experience. You can see humpback whales, fin whales, white-sided dolphin, like here down in the bottom right corner. But you can also see, if you see that center picture in the bottom, just the density of birds sometimes on the water as you're going between the islands. It's absolutely incredible. Early in the season, it's also quite possible to see icebergs. The St. John's area is not always the best part of the island for seeing icebergs, but lots of years they do reach down here, and earlier in the season, you can sometimes see them up close and personal from these boat tours out to the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve. So one seabird I failed to mention, talking about the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve for a reason, are the northern gannets. Absolutely one of the most majestic seabirds, I think, anywhere in the world, certainly here in the North Atlantic, with their 6-foot wingspan and those beautiful yellowish tinged heads. And they're so agile on those wings. We do often see gannets on the boat tours into Witless Bay Ecological Reserve, but they're just there feeding. They're one of the few seabirds that do not breed in the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve. So you'll see them feeding and plunge diving and flying by the boat. Most tours, you'll see a few. But if you really want to experience the northern gannet, you have to go about 2.5 hours south of St. John's to the Cape St. Mary's Ecological Reserve. This is one of my absolute favorite places to visit. Again, I'm lucky I get to go there weekly throughout the summer, and it is just, it never gets less interesting or less exciting to go there. Cape St. Mary's is home to one of the continent's largest and certainly one of the most accessible colonies of northern gannets. And you can see here that following a short one mile hike about from the lighthouse out over these gorgeous cliff tops and barrens, you arrive at a giant sea stack where there are about 17,000 pairs of gannets nesting at the top of this sea stack and the surrounding cliffs. So more than 30,000 gannets at any one time are nesting there. It's an absolute cacophony. They're very loud. It's an incredible experience. The smells, it hits all of your senses at once when you walk out there. You get to within about 30 meters of the birds for the most part, which is great for really close binocular views, incredibly close scope views, and great for photographers. Photographers absolutely love it here because it's land-based. You can set up, and the birds are close enough, as you can see from some of my photos, for absolutely fantastic photo opportunities. And the light changes there so much throughout the day that photographers are never bored. Wildlife and bird photographers that I know that have come here, Cape St. Mary's is always one of the top destinations and highlights of their visit. So you can see one of my photographer friends here on the top, and you can actually see my oldest daughter there on the bottom. That was her first trip to Cape St. Mary's with me last year, and even she was absolutely enthralled with the close views and the photography opportunities with these northern gannets. Just some more views of Cape St. Mary's. This was on a trip I did last summer with some people that some of you in the birding world may actually recognize. We have Jason Ward there looking through the scope, and Ted Floyd and Nate Swick with the American Birding Association Nick Lund, who's very well known on social media, hanging over the edge of the cliff there, looking down at Gannets actually flying below him. So it really is that kind of a place. Yeah, so it is an amazing place. We just never have enough time to spend there when we go, but it's just an incredible place to experience and to see, and the birds are just part of it. In addition to the northern gannets, of course, they're not the only seabirds breeding there. You can also find common murre, black guillemot, lots and lots of black-legged kittiwake nesting in the cliffs right alongside the northern gannets. And it's also the world's most southerly location for breeding thick-billed murre, which you can find here as well. So it's not just the gannets that draw you to Cape St. Mary's. It's the scenery and it's all the other birds. It's absolutely an incredible place. And if you look at the photo here on the far right, it's a little bit more of how that sea stack is oriented. So it really is a sea stack that's separated from the mainland. And that's why the gannets are nesting there in the first place, because they're safe from land predators there. It's a very secure, safe place for them to nest. And you can see the people there on the far right. That's sort of the viewing area where we're overlooking the colony. Just an absolutely wonderful place. But it's also a really neat habitat. It's a very rare habitat that we call the Eastern Hyperoceanic Barrens. And it really is the world's most southern example of subarctic tundra. It's very tundra-like, and because of its location right on the edge of the coast with all the cool winds and the fog coming in off the ocean, it keeps the climate just that little bit cooler, that we get a lot of subalpine and subarctic plants growing there. So you can see here on the left some moss campion, in the center some diapensia, which is another sort of subalpine type plant that's pretty rare anywhere else at that elevation. And we have some orchids here on the right, the tall northern green orchid. For butterfly enthusiasts, up here on the top, that's a short-tailed swallowtail, which is a very range-restricted butterfly. Newfoundland is one of the only places in the world actually where you can see it. And it loves open headlands, just like you can see here at Cape St. Mary's. So it's one of the cool places that you can actually get to see this butterfly. So lots of really cool things besides the birds to make a day trip to Cape St. Mary's worthwhile. And if you're into photography and spending some real time with the birds, I often suggest to people to stay in the area overnight so you get a couple of days down here. It is just an absolutely wonderful place to spend some of your time. But not all of our seabirds are breeders here. Later in the summer, in mid to late summer, we get visitors from other species of seabird that do not breed on the island or in Labrador. Probably the most recognizable of those for lots of people are the shearwaters, which are known locally by fishermen as hagdowns and bocks. There are lots of really neat local names for a lot of species of birds here in Newfoundland, and that's a whole nother talk. But it's a lot of fun to hear the local fishermen, especially referring to some of these birds by their local, very unique names. So the hagdowns and bocks, which are the sooty and great shearwaters, they come from far away to chase the fish that we have in our oceans at this time of year, which is the reason that most all of the seabirds are here. And they come in huge numbers. So these birds actually bred during our winter in the southern hemisphere and have flown all the way from the southern hemisphere up here to the North Atlantic to feed on our abundance of spawning fish such as capelin. So we do get 3 species of shearwater regularly in our waters. We have the great shearwater and the sooty shearwater that you can see here in the center, both of which can sometimes be seen in the thousands during a day, certainly in the dozens and hundreds, but some days in the thousands. And that's without leaving shore in lots of cases. They can be seen feeding right along the coastline. You can see this photo in the bottom right of great and sooty shearwater sitting on the water. That was actually taken right from the road near Cape Race one day when they were feeding on fish right in the shallows. Absolutely incredible. In the top right here, we have a Manx shearwater, which sort of breaks the rule that I've said about not breeding here. Manx shearwater actually is the one shearwater species that in very small numbers is known to breed on a few select islands in southern Newfoundland. One of the only places I think in North America where Manx shearwater is known to breed. So it's pretty neat. And we do get those in small numbers, usually mixed in with the great sooty shearwaters in late summer. Late summer is also when we start seeing yagers showing up along our coast. Certainly not in those kinds of numbers, and it takes a little more luck to find them. But we do get all three species of yager most summers. So Pomeranian, parasitic yager, and the long-tailed yager. This is a juvenile long-tailed yager that you can see here on the right. And we actually found this one. It was on land feeding on berries. It was very tame. Very interesting to see a yager sort of walking around on the ground feeding on berries, when we're so used to seeing most of them chasing and harassing the local kittiwakes in order to get some fish. So the yagers are another seabird that you can see here later in the summer, if you're lucky. And though they're not really a seabird, I thought I'd throw them in here. Red and red-necked phalaropes. Late summer is a great time. They're certainly not seabirds, but they are very oceanic, and they spend most of their migration time on the ocean here. So during some of these boat tours, it's actually a great time in late summer to sort of be able to see these little flocks of these shorebirds out needling around on the ocean, and sometimes in extremely rough waters. But you can get quite close to them in the boat sometimes, so it's a great time to sort of see those as well. But I've spent a lot of time talking about seabirds so far, and I don't want to give you the impression that even though the seabirds are absolutely so amazing, I don't want to give you the impression that it's all you can see in Newfoundland, because that's certainly not the case. It's easy to get caught up in the seabirds while you're here, but Newfoundland and Labrador is a big, diverse province, and there are a lot of other birds to see. So for example, here, just in this collage, you can see boreal chickadee, mourning warbler there in the top right, willow ptarmigan, pine grosbeak, yellow-bellied flycatcher, black-throated green warbler. So a real great diversity of birds that you can see depending on where you travel on the island, or into Labrador as well. So there's a lot of different habitats on the island, and usually every habitat has its own suite of birds. So if you're going to be planning a trip to Newfoundland, I certainly suggest that you take some time to make sure you plan some stops in several of these different habitats in order to experience the different diversity of bird life in those habitats. One of the most obvious ones, of course, is our boreal forests. All of Newfoundland is in the boreal region, so all of our forests are considered to be boreal forests or northern forests. We have very rich forests here, and in lots of cases, they're big, huge tracts of forest, because as you can imagine, such a large province with only 500,000 people scattered throughout it, there are lots of unsettled areas, big tracts of forest that you can, very lush forests, everything from boreal chickadee and olive-sided flycatcher. You can see here various species of warbler. If you were to plan your visits correctly, you can probably find between 15 and 18 species of breeding warbler in Newfoundland and Labrador during the summer. So a real great diversity of a lot of these boreal warblers. Spruce grouse, and you can see this red crossbill that's down here, the second in from the bottom right, next to the pine grosbeak. Red crossbill on the island. We have a race that's considered to be endemic to Newfoundland and Labrador, Perkna. So it's a race that only exists on the island. It's non-migratory. It's also considered endangered. The numbers have just totally plummeted in the last 30 or so years, although I think we're starting to see some recovery in the numbers right now. So it's really neat to actually see red crossbill here, because it's one of those endemic races that could one day actually be split out, like the Cassia crossbill recently was, into a separate species. And if you see the big honking bill on this picture, the Newfoundland red crossbill on average has the largest bill of all the red crossbills. So it's a really interesting race and a really cool bird to see while you're here. So because all of Newfoundland is in the boreal forest, there's lots of great places to explore the forests. But that being said, the forests are actually quite diverse, and they change quite a bit as you go from east to west. So if you start here on the Avalon Peninsula in the east, the forests are very, very coniferous, with very little hardwood or deciduous trees mixed in. And then as you head off of the Avalon through central Newfoundland and towards the west coast, the forests get more and more diverse as you go. With it's not so hard out there to find forests that are predominantly birch or balsam poplar or aspen. So a lot more hardwoods mixed into the primarily coniferous forests. So as the diversity of the forest changes from east to west, so does the diversity of songbirds um, that breed in those forests. So while you'll come to the Avalon Peninsula here on the east for the seabird colonies, that's where most of them are congregated. In order to get to experience the largest diversity of songbirds, you'll want to sort of head out into other parts of central and western Newfoundland and explore some of those areas. Terra Nova National Park, just 2.5 hours from St. John's, is a wonderful place to spend some time and explore some of those really neat coastal boreal forests. Central Newfoundland around Grand Falls, Gander, also has some really interesting forests and lots of great hiking trails. Grossmore National Park, a wonderful place to explore, and again, an even more diverse forest with lots of neat bird life. And the Codroy Valley in southwestern Newfoundland has more of a maritime type forest, and it undoubtedly has the greatest songbird diversity during the summer of the entire island. So the Codroy Valley, if you get a chance, it's not super popular with tourists for some reason, but it's an absolutely beautiful place, and birding wise, it's got great diversity. So just a lovely place to go and explore if you're going to visit here. And wetlands, boy, have we got wetlands. One of the things that tourists often mention to me when they're here and we're driving and exploring is, boy, do you have lots of bogs and fens and ponds and lakes, and we do. The whole province is just dotted in them. We have a lot of different kinds of wetlands. So it's no trouble to find lots of interesting places to explore and look for wetland species in Newfoundland and Labrador. Some of them are obviously a little more difficult to find, which is part of what makes exploring wetlands so fun. Skulky species like the American bittern here in the top right, or in the bottom left, your Wilson snipe and sora can certainly be harder to spot, be more easily heard than seen in most cases. And then you have some very obvious species like the northern pintail and the ring-necked duck. But common loon is something that's incredibly abundant here. People are often surprised how easy it is to find and see breeding plumaged common loons. They're breeding all over the place here. So we're very fortunate that that's a bird that's very common and easy to see here. And there are wetlands everywhere. I mean, it's absolutely, I can't really pick out particular spots where as a tourist you'd want to go. I would just make sure that you plan some stops in some of the local wetlands wherever you're traveling. The two photos here on the right are right here in St. John's, a local lake and a local park with a boardwalk that crosses over a large marsh. The two pictures on the left in Grand Falls, Windsor, with that beautiful boardwalk going over the large marsh there. And on the top left corner is the Codroy Valley, which has some incredibly rich, large estuaries. And it's actually the only Ramsar site in the entire province. So a very important bird area, very lovely estuary, and another reason to visit the Codroy area. Absolutely gorgeous. And the last habitat I sort of want to mention is probably my favorite in lots of ways. And those are the barrens, what we sort of collectively refer to as barrens here in Newfoundland. We have coastal barrens, subarctic tundra, all along the coast in places here, and also areas of subalpine tundra at some of the higher elevations, sort of very windswept, open, rocky areas at the tops of especially the Long Range Mountains in the west coast. And they're incredible places, and they may not have as large diversity of birds as some of the forests, but certainly they have some specialty species, some very neat things that you're just not going to see elsewhere. The top left there, willow ptarmigan, is pretty widespread on the island. It can be found on fairly low elevations on any of our barrens. And horned lark, the same thing, can be found pretty well island wide. American pipits breed along the cliff edges at the edges of some of these barrens along the coast. Short-eared owl. Here in the bottom middle, rock ptarmigan is a bit of a more specialized species. It only really likes the very high elevations. So they're going to be found at the summits of some of the mountain ranges and the ridges in Newfoundland. They're a little harder to get to. It takes a little more dedication and planning in order to find rock ptarmigan in the island. But if you get into the right habitat, they're actually fairly common up there. So yeah, so that's something that if you want to see it when you're in Newfoundland, you need to do a little bit of planning, but it's well worth it to get up there and look for these guys. And Savannah sparrow here in the bottom right as well, of course, another very widespread grassland type species that breeds in some of the barren habitats in Newfoundland. So yeah, I absolutely love exploring the coastal barrens and all of these tundra type habitats. You can see some photos here of some friends and I exploring those. We have Nate Swick looking out over some of the coastal tundra. This is actually at the edge of the Mistaken Point UNESCO Reserve, down at on this very southern tip of the Avalon. Absolutely beautiful area down there to be. We were looking for willow ptarmigan at the time, and we did find some. And you have a photo of Derek Whitaker with Parks Canada and Jody Allaire of Birds Canada. We actually hiked up to the top of one of the summits in Grossmorn National Park to see that very rock ptarmigan that you saw the photo of on the previous slide, with a beautiful view down over Bond Bay at the edge of Grossmorn Park there. So you can see the talus type habitat that the rock ptarmigan really seem to like up there. And of course, caribou is another reason to visit some of these habitats. We have the world's southernmost population of caribou on the island. There are a number of herds throughout the island. You can find them in various places, but they do tend to like those barren habitats for the most part for foraging. And with a little dedication, you can usually find caribou on a visit to Newfoundland if you know where to be looking. And again, lots of cool plants like the alpine azalea that you can see there, subalpine plants that are growing in some of these really neat habitats. So some areas, if you're in eastern Newfoundland, there are some really easy areas to explore some of the coastal barrens, the hyperoceanic barrens that we were talking about. Cape Race at the very southeast corner is, and you can see it actually in the picture, you see the lighthouse in the bottom left corner there, that photo. Cape Race is an absolutely wonderful place to go and explore, both for birding, but also for the scenery and the history of the area. Cape St. Mary's Ecological Reserve itself has some absolutely beautiful tundra and that you can be exploring. You're exploring it even as you walk out to the Gannet colony. Cape Bonavista, an area up at the northern tip there. And on the west coast, it's a little bit easier to get access to some of the higher elevation subalpine tundra to look for things like rock ptarmigan and white-crowned sparrow, American tree sparrow that breeds up there. The Long Range Mountains are actually an extension of the Appalachians that run from the very southwestern corner of Newfoundland all the way up into the northern peninsula there, and they run right through Grossmorn National Park. So that's one of the really great areas to go to explore those, because of course there's lots of hiking trails in the park and lots of fairly easy ways to access some of those elevations if you don't mind a little bit of a challenging hike. So some really cool areas, and again, it really, in order to explore these areas fully, I highly recommend that you plan traveling across the island and stopping in some of these different places. So far we've been sort of talking about what you can see during the breeding season, starting in mid-May, going through July in Newfoundland. Then things start to get a little bit quiet. By the middle of July, the songbirds are starting to get really quiet. They've raised their family. They're sort of really skulky, harder to find. The seabirds start leaving their colonies. Once the chicks have fledged, lots of them start in early August. So by late summer, things are pretty quiet. But nature has a really neat way of sort of filling those gaps for us as birders. And one of the neat things about late summer here is that that's when shorebird migration starts for us. So even though we've only got a small handful of shorebirds that actually breed in Newfoundland in particular, but even into Labrador, there's not such a large diversity in the southern parts. There's only a handful that breed here. In the late summer and early fall, there are more than 20 species that pass through the province during migration. We don't see them in spring. They migrate mostly in the central flyways when they're heading northward, but we get them coming down the coast in the fall. So the shorebirds sure add a lot of value to birding in late summer and early fall when a lot of the other species have sort of gotten a little bit quiet. We don't tend to get the huge flocks of shorebirds that you might be familiar with and seeing pictures from parts of New England or in the Bay of Fundy, where you can see thousands of shorebirds in a flock. We tend to get smaller numbers, but I think that's just great actually, because we get good diversity, but in small flocks. And it's really a great way to be able to study them. They are a challenging group for a lot of birders. So it's a great way to sort of get to know the shorebirds a little bit. There's a lot less of them. You can tend to get fairly close to them and study them at close range. And it's great for photography. It's great for learning to distinguish the different ages and the different species of the shorebirds. So it is absolutely one of my favorite parts of late summer is the shorebird migration that we get here. So again, that sort of starts in late July, early August for us and goes through to maybe late September, early October. The last of the shorebirds are passing through. We get a good diversity. You see short-billed dowitchers here, American golden plover. They love our open tundras and grasslands. White-rumped sandpiper is one of our most common migrants. I know it's one that can be harder to see in lots of other places, but it's a very common migrant here. Yeah, so it's absolutely one of the really interesting things that you can do if you happen to find yourself in Newfoundland late in summer, is to spend some time checking out the diversity of shorebirds that we have passing through. But winter, and I think winter is probably our best kept secret here in Newfoundland. I'm going to tell you all now, so I guess it's not a secret anymore. Winter, of course, it brings with it a whole new suite of birds. Most of our colorful warblers and all that have all headed south, and a lot of our breeding songbirds have migrated away. We still have lots of cool resident birds that stay here all winter long. Canada jays and boreal chickadees and pine grosbeaks and willow ptarmigan that you see in the collage here. A lot of those are birds that are here year round, so they're still here in winter, and it can be a really great time to go look for them. But we also get a lot of birds that are visiting from further north. Believe it or not, there are a lot of birds who consider Newfoundland to be south. They come south for the winter to Newfoundland. You see the dovekey there in the top left corner. Probably one of the reasons that birders come to Newfoundland in winter the most is Newfoundland is one of the only places in North America where you can see dovekey reliably from land during the winter. So it's a great place for people to come and see their lifer dovekeys. Lots of times they're very tame. Sometimes they're swimming around at the coast just meters away from you. A very cool experience, and definitely one of the reasons that birders like to come here in the winter. But things like purple sandpiper in the top right corner there, Bohemian waxwing, all coming to visit us from further north. So winter, if you want to see those, winter is the time to see them. And it's a very popular for a lot of the ABA listers to come here, because there are several species like Bohemian waxwing, dovekey that are tough to see in other parts of North America. Purple sandpiper, those kinds of things. And this is sort of a place where you can come and see them fairly reliably and sometimes in good numbers. So if you don't mind the cold, then it can be really rewarding to visit Newfoundland and go birding for a week or so in the winter. And I'm happy to talk more about that to anybody who's interested in coming for winter. I do offer tours in the winter, and it's getting more and more popular every year. So you just dress warmly and head over. I always like this slide because it gives the impression that all of our winter birds are black and white. But you do see that the top right corner there is a tufted duck. Of course, tufted duck is a rarity in North America. It's a European species that breeds as far west as Iceland, but it doesn't breed anywhere in North America, except we have a common, like a wintering flock in St. John's of upwards of 70 birds that, as far as we can tell, migrates back and forth from Iceland. So St. John's itself is the only place in North America where tufted duck is not a rarity. It's actually a common part of our winter scene. And you can get some really great point blank views of this absolutely gorgeous duck here in the winter. guaranteed. One of the few birds I'll guarantee. Again, dovekey in the bottom middle there. You can get really close, up close and personal with dovekey as they feed in the shallows here. I recommend coming in January if anybody's interested in winter birding and specifically wants to see dovekey. I recommend January. It's the most reliable month for seeing them. They're a little less reliable in December, and they start to get more and more scarce in February. Most of the other species are here throughout the winter. The top left, we've got a winter plumaged thick-billed murre. So it's another one that you can expect to see sometimes. They do winter right off our coast here in pretty good numbers, and lots of times you can get pretty good looks at them as they come in fairly close to shore as well. But just to prove that not all of our winter birds are black and white, there are lots of other cool birds that you can see here in winter. Bohemian waxwing, they're eruptive. Some years we get them in large numbers, some years not quite so much. But guaranteed every year we do get some, and they're always a pleasure to see. Sometimes they come in just huge flocks as well. Absolutely beautiful birds, and I look forward to seeing them every winter. We have a boreal owl there in the top center. It is a species that's here. It's resident. It stays all winter long. It's pretty rarely seen though. So I don't want to advertise that as something you can expect to see when you come to Newfoundland. But it is one that is here, and if you get really lucky, which I always look forward to any opportunity to see a boreal owl. Your Asian widgeon there in the bottom right, another duck like the tufted duck that's fairly rare throughout most of North America, but it's a common wintering species here, and we presume that most of them they disappear in the spring. We presume most of them are migrating back and forth to breeding grounds, probably in Iceland, along with the tufted ducks. Purple sandpiper. This is sort of towards the southern range of the wintering grounds for purple sandpiper. It's absolutely my favorite shorebird. It's so hardy. It's got the most northerly range of any shorebird species. And they winter here in Newfoundland in the harshest of situations. They winter on these little rock jetties that jut out into the roughest kinds of ocean water. Really, really tough birds. Absolutely incredible. And to think that most of their cousins are running around on hot sandy beaches in January down in Argentina or somewhere in South America, and these guys have decided to winter in Newfoundland of all places. Absolutely love them for that. It's absolutely cool. Snowy owls are a pretty regular feature, more some years than others as well. And we get eruptions of winter finch into Newfoundland as well. Things like white-winged crossbills, common redpoll, those kinds of things, show up in some years in huge numbers and are fairly easy to see. And then we have resident species like pine grosbeak as well. That's here all year long. And the gulls, I cannot go through a talk without talking about the gulls. Anyone who knows me knows that the gulls are probably my favorite group of birds. I know they can be challenging, but they are birds too. Gulls are birds too, and we get a very rich variety of gulls in Newfoundland during winter. St. John's itself has a very strong wintering flock, and it's very diverse. You can see upwards of a dozen different species in a day just by going around St. John's and checking out the local ponds and fields. Lots and lots of Iceland gull, probably are one of the most numerous gulls in St. John's during the winter, mostly of the Kumlians form. But it's a great chance to get to know your northern white-winged species if you're into gulls at all. Iceland gulls and glaucous gulls are quite numerous in St. John's. Black-headed gull is a regular feature in Newfoundland during the winter, but also they breed at a few places in the summer. So if you know where to go, you can find the only breeding black-headed gulls in North America here in Newfoundland. But winter is also a great time to see them. Things like mew gull, European mew gull or common gull. Not in big numbers, but we do see a few every winter in Newfoundland. So absolutely, learning your gulls and checking out the gulls is a great thing to spend a day doing in St. John's. And it helps get a lot of us desperate local birders through some otherwise pretty tough months. It can be a long winter here, and the gulls are certainly one of the features that help us get through it. And finally, I can't not talk about our rare visitors from Europe. Because of our location on the very eastern edge of North America, where we are, we tend to get a fairly regular stream of rarities that visit from Europe. Some of them have become fairly regular, like the tufted duck and the Eurasian widgeon, that we can no longer call rare here in Newfoundland. They've become a part um, of our regular avian situation, our regular bird population here during certain months. But others are still pretty rare visitors. And different species have a tendency to show up at different times of the year, but at the rarest, they're usually found during spring and fall migration. So if chasing rarities, if you're an ABA lister and chasing these European rarities is something that you're into, it's usually going to be spring and sometimes fall migration when you're going to want to keep your ear to the ground about these things showing up in Newfoundland. So here in the collage, you've got up in the top left a redwing, which is a European cousin of our American robin. It's in the same family. Very rare in North America. For a number of years, it was just about annual, although it's gotten pretty scarce again in the last few years. They tend to get found in winter, hanging out with roving flocks of American robins when they do get found. Top center, you've got a Eurasian oyster catcher. Newfoundland has 5 of the 6 records in North America. And the most recent one was actually this spring, back in April or May. So yeah, so you know, those kinds of things are extremely rare in North America. They show up with some regularity in Newfoundland. Northern wheat ear, I listed as a rarity, although it actually breeds in parts of northern Labrador. But otherwise, we tend to, during migration, we get a few stragglers every year coming either from Labrador or Greenland. European golden plover here on the left in the center. Extremely rare anywhere in North America. I think there are only a handful of records anywhere outside of Newfoundland. But it's one that shows up pretty much every year somewhere in Newfoundland during April or May. And in some years, depending on the weather, we can actually get flocks of them. So it's pretty neat. I mean, it's the only place where they show up with any regularity in all of North America. Northern lapwing here on the right, another plover it was pretty regular in Newfoundland for a few years. Again, it's gotten pretty scarce the last few years. They usually tend to show up in sort of late fall, early winter when they do show up here. Black-tailed godwit in the bottom left there is just about annual. We get one show up similar to the European golden plovers, but in smaller numbers, just about every year somewhere in Newfoundland. Sometimes, depending on the weather, we'll get several. In the middle bottom there, common redshank. It's only 3, I think, North American records, and they're all from here in Newfoundland. So it's one that breeds in Iceland, but a pretty rare straggler to anywhere in North America, even to Newfoundland. And common swift there in the bottom right. We have one of the only 2 records of common swift for Newfoundland. I think there are only 3 for all of Canada, and our 2 may be the only ones in eastern North America that were ever photographed. So it's pretty awesome. It's one of the coolest things about birding in Newfoundland is you never know what you're going to find, and looking for these European rarities is a big part of our daily routine and something that always gets us excited. And it also gets lots of other people from parts of North America excited. A lot of the listers will, almost at the drop of a hat, plan trips to Newfoundland to see some of these rare visitors if they're going to hang around. It's just some more photos of some of the rare visitors we've had over the year. Fieldfare, chaffinch, gray heron. We've had several records of gray heron up there on the right. This was the most recent one a couple of years ago in November. Again, European golden plover, yellow-legged gull, which was pretty regular in St. John's annual for a number of years, although it's gotten to be rarer in the last few years and not nearly as reliable as it was for about a decade in the early 2000s. So I hope that I've shown you lots of great things and great reasons to come to Newfoundland, and that all you're left with now is asking yourself, when are you going to come to visit? Newfoundland is a fantastic birding destination. Doesn't matter what time of year you come. If you want to come in summer to see all the seabirds, if you want to come in winter to see some of our amazing winter birds. So it's just about deciding what season speaks to you. But I also want to remind you that it's not just about the birds. Newfoundland has so much else to offer, whether it's icebergs or whales or our incredible history and culture, lots of great food. It's becoming a real foodie destination here now. There's been a real food revolution in the restaurants. Some of Canada's top restaurants are located here in St. John's and then throughout eastern Newfoundland. And there's so much amazing scenery. Um, so, here's the thing. I'm happy to help anyone plan a trip. I'm happy to chat about when is the best time to come, depending on what you want to see. A little chart here in the bottom left, you can sort of see, might help you decide some things. So for example, if you want to come and see the puffins, then you need to come anytime between mid-May and mid-August. But if at the same time, if you want to see whales, you want to come a little bit later into that season. But if you want to see icebergs, you need to come a little bit earlier. So it's about deciding what are some of the things in Newfoundland that you want to see, and choosing the right week or 2 weeks that works for you. And I'm always happy to chat more about Newfoundland, to help people plan trips, to tell you more about some of the tours that I offer. I offer a lot of day tours, here in eastern Newfoundland that go to Cape St. Mary's and Witless Bay. We do a lot of forest birding, but I can also help you plan some trips that include visits to other parts of western Newfoundland, for example, for some of the other scenery and some of the more diverse songbirds. So you can check out my website here. I'll leave this slide up long enough for you guys to write it down. But you can follow along on my adventures on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. I'm always trying to share photos and stories about birding here in Newfoundland when I can. So I'd love to hear from all of you, and hopefully host some of you here someday. All right, thank you. I'll hand it back to Jeff, I guess, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to keep talking, as you can tell.
There are indeed some questions and a lot of good comments. So I'll start on some of that. It's like, there was one from the chat, and then we've got other 8, it looks like, in Q&A. And let me begin with the one from chat, since I don't lose that. It's kind of interesting. Yvonne asks us, what cones or what species of conifer do the endemic crossbills prefer with that large bill? And that's an interesting question.
Well, pine, traditionally pine has sort of been their, red pine, but that's a species that's been overlogged in Newfoundland. Was probably never that common in the first place. So that's probably part of the reason why they've declined so much. But moving on from that, they tend to like to go for eastern larch quite a bit. The tamarack or eastern larch tends to be their main natural food. One of the things that I think has helped the red crossbill here in the last number of years is that all of a sudden they seem to have taken to feeders, and red crossbills are coming to feeders a lot more often. So even though they're still fairly scarce to see, with a little bit of planning and your ear to the ground to the local birding scene, you can probably find them fairly easily, even at some feeders.
Excellent. Okay, well that's a good tip. John asks, are you allowed on the islands at Witless Bay, or can you only see from a boat?
You can only see from a boat. So though the reserve is a protected reserve, the only people allowed on the islands are researchers. And so you can see it. We get incredibly close on the boats, which is great, especially in great weather. You can get very close to the birds. But for closer, prolonged views of the puffins, I do recommend going maybe somewhere like Elliston if you're interested in photography. But there's no getting on the islands, unfortunately.
We also ask, what is the optimal time of year to visit Newfoundland? That was before your final slide, so you may have actually answered that question. But when can you expect the greatest number of species of birds? I think you probably covered that, but if you wanted to.
Yeah, I usually tell people if it's the largest number of birds you want to see, then June is the best time. That's when all the birds are singing. So all of our migrant songbirds are here. They're in full song and easier to find. And the seabird colonies are also in full gear. So June is a great time to come. Anytime sort of between the 1st of June and the first week of July is great. So that's what I usually tell people if they're really interested in seeing all of those things. And then it's sort of to decide what else besides the birds you want to see. For a lot of people, it's a toss-up between the whales and the icebergs. And it sort of balances earlier in the season for icebergs, later for the whales to be more reliable.
Yeah, so it really sounds like you have to kind of customize to meet your expectations and contact you for.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always happy to chat about timing.
Perfect. We've got 2 different questions related to insects. You knew it was coming, you know. One specifically, are there black-legged ticks in Newfoundland? The second one relates to biting flies, in particular in the boreal forest. From someone that was there but was on the coast the whole time, was wondering how bad the flies might be inland in summer.
Yeah. So yeah, two good questions. When it comes to the ticks, it's we have, up until recently, Newfoundland has been tick-free, black-legged tick-free. So we've always sort of prided ourselves in that we can thrash through the woods without any worries of being an island. We don't have lots of things. We don't have poison ivy. We don't have ticks. You know, lots of the things that you would worry about in other places. We don't think about here. But in the last couple of years, there's been it seems like ticks are starting to make it, especially into the West Coast a little bit. So if you want to come and be tick-free, I would suggest coming in the next couple of years. It seems like the ticks are moving their way into Newfoundland, but still very relatively low risk of encountering one here so far. As for the biting flies, we do have biting flies, black flies, and mosquitoes. I tend to find that they're not too bad. Labrador is known for it. A lot of black flies in Labrador, but the island, not so bad. And as the person asked in the question mentioned, lots of times when we're birding, we're on the coast here anyways, and you don't see a single fly. But when you do get into the interior and into some of the forests, the mosquitoes and black flies can be bothersome, but I would not say that they're super thick in my experience.
Great. No, that's good. Here's one that maybe we can do as we're answering. Someone asked if you could put the slide with your website links back up, and we can talk right over that if you want to keep that up. Actually, it might not be a bad idea. We can keep that going. Someone asked a different one here as to where do you find the greatest butterfly diversity in Newfoundland?
Oh boy, the butterfly diversity. You know, that's something that I don't know where I would say to go for the greatest diversity.
There it is.
You know, certainly central Newfoundland, where the average climate tends to be a little bit warmer than it is here in the east, is a little bit better for butterflies. I've seen a few species out there, Arctic Judah being one that I haven't seen on the Avalon. But for the most part, the diversity is pretty similar throughout the island. We don't have as large numbers as parts of mainland Canada like Ontario. We don't have that kind of diversity. But we do have some pretty cool species, Arctic blue, northern blue, short-tailed swallowtail, which, as I said, is you know, it's near endemic to Newfoundland. It's one of the few places in the world you can see it. And you can see those, you know, all through the island in the right habitats.
Okay, that sounds good. Scott asked if you can kind of quantify the peak times for spring migration and fall migration, respectively.
Yeah, well, you know, one thing I always say to people is that migration is not the spectacle, at least songbird migration is not the spectacle here that it is in some places, because we tend to be a destination. A lot of birds, you know, the songbirds that are migrating to Newfoundland, this is where they're staying. And birds that are migrating further north of us tend to go up through Quebec, you know, into Labrador. So we don't get a lot of passage migrants. So we tend to get just the songbirds that are coming here, the only ones passing through for the most part. So we don't see large migration activity. It tends to sort of happen fairly slowly over the course of May for the most part. Very few migrants in April. Fall migration is a little bit different in that we tend to get more wayward birds. We get passage migrants like Lapland longspurs and things coming down through. And mid-September to mid-October would be the sort of the prime time for fall migration.
Great. Move from fall migration, we'll segue right into winter. Since you did it, there's two questions from winter. I think we can lump into one again. You know, one is asking how easy is it to bird based out of St. John's in winter, and another asking how strenuous is the winter birding? You know, me personally, coming from Florida, I wonder what your opinion of cold is. You said it can get a little cold, and it's probably different from my perception. Although I lived in Alaska years ago, so
yeah. Well, one of the neat things about winter birding is that, for the most part, most of the target birds you want to see in winter are right here in or around St. John's. So all of my winter tours are based out of St. John's. We spend all our nights in St. John's. We do day trips, fairly short day trips, a few hours driving out of St. John's. And we hit pretty much all of the regular targets. The only time you'd want to sort of wander further away from St. John's is if a rarity shows up, something that you needed to chase that was further away. Other than that, I always advise people, if you're coming here for winter birding, you base yourself out of St. John's and you're as good as anywhere. And you have, in the evenings, because we have long evenings in the winter, you have lots of great restaurants and other things to take advantage of when you're staying in St. John's. So winter birding, plan for a St. John's based stay. As to how strenuous it is, depends on what you mean by strenuous. We don't do a lot of hiking. We do a lot of birding from at or near the car. So we tend to do more driving and short walks from the car. Coastal birding is usually, within sight of the car. We don't do a lot of long hikes in the winter. There's no need to, for the most part. Most birds are fairly accessible. If you're talking strenuous when it comes to weather, that's a loaded question. Newfoundland, we tend to have a very temperate climate because we're very mediated by the ocean. So we don't get as hot summers. We also don't really get as cold winters as mainland Canada or central Canada. So actual temperatures don't get as low. But that being said, it's that old saying, dry cold, wet cold. We do have a damp, it's humid here. So we do have a damp cold, and it can be very windy. So while the actual temperatures are not very low, it can feel quite cold. So I definitely recommend when you come here birding in the winter that you bring lots of layers. But it's certainly nothing, it's nothing that's it's not handleable.
And as you've already pointed out, you're close to the car.
Yeah, we're always close to the car. It's usually short times out of the car and a chance to warm up in the car and grab a coffee.
Yeah.
So we're
We're
not out in the elements.
I might be that guy. It's like, I'm going to check on the car, make sure everything's all right. Equip it, I'll be back.
Well, I always keep a thermos of hot chocolate and coffee in the car, and then we don't tend to be out in the elements for long periods, which is it's one of the great things about birding here in winter.
All right, and a final question: other than humans and cats, are there any natural enemies for the shorebirds? I know I saw at least one in one of your slides, little orange one, but I'll let you answer what all they got.
So, any natural enemies for the shorebirds?
Yeah.
Don't tend to be a lot. We do have mink, unfortunately, introduced to the island, and short-tailed weasel, which will hunt birds along the coast. Most of the predators for shorebirds here are other birds. So merlins coming through, and sharp-shinned hawks. Merlins especially, the peregrines tend to chase the shorebirds. But there's not a lot of other real predators that specialize in shorebirds, particularly, besides other birds of prey.
Excellent. And I don't know, I mean, is there a big problem, going off of that just personally, with the seabirds, the nesting seabirds? Is there much of a gull predation issue and things of that nature? Or?
Well, the gulls are the biggest predators of the seabirds on the nesting islands. So, for example, in the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve, where all those puffins nest, great blackback gull tends to be the biggest predator of the puffins and their chicks. We do have lots of bald eagles as well on the island, and they will they're not so much a problem as for being a predator as the fact that they fly over the islands a lot, and then it causes the adult birds to flush off the nest, and things like murres especially, because they just lay their egg on a bare rock ledge. When the murres fly off the cliff, they leave their eggs open, and that's when the great blackback gulls and the herring gulls and the crows and ravens fly in and pillage the eggs. So the bald eagles indirectly are having a negative impact on predation, but even if they're not the predator themselves in lots of cases.
Perfect. Well, I think we've wrapped up the Q&A, and with that, I'll just give a reminder to those that are still with us that, as always, we will have a recording of this evergreen posted to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/user/Kowa Sporting Optics, or you can even search for Kowa Sporting Optics. If you can't find it there, you can always link from our Facebook page. Again, Kowa Sporting Optics. And since we live stream, there is, of course, a copy there already. So with that, we thank you again for dropping by. Jared, thanks so much for giving us your Saturday afternoon and bringing us on this wonderful tour. I'm ready to go.
I'll put the kettle on, Jeff.
Yeah, all right. I'm coming up. Although, from the sounds of things, I think we might do some gulling in January. You know, that sounds like a hoot. You know, to just pull out my woolies and old boots, see if I can still handle the cold. But that'd be great. So, thanks again. Oh, we got another question just popped in. The YouTube address again is youtube.com/user/Kowa Sporting Optics, all one mush together. And again, if you can't find that, just go to our Facebook page, Kowa Sporting Optics, and you'll see follow-up links for Jared's talk. Plus, it's there now because we've broadcast live there as well. So thanks again, everybody, for giving us a portion of your Saturday afternoon. Have a great day. The rest of it that's left, have some time with your loved ones. Have fun, and we're going to check out. Thanks so much, everybody.